October 25, 1944. 0658 hours. Off Samar Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, his binoculars trained on the horizon as the first rays of dawn broke through the tropical haze. What he saw made his blood run cold. Emerging from the gray morning mist like steel mountains rising from the sea were the unmistakable pagoda masts of Japanese battleships. Not one. Not two. But four massive capital ships, accompanied by 6 heavy cruisers and a screen of destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled in the Pacific was bearing down on his position at 25 knots. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Evans lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face betraying no emotion to the young sailors around him. At 46 years old, he was considered ancient for a destroyer commander. His hands, scarred from years of naval service, gripped the railing as he made a calculation that would have seemed insane to any reasonable naval officer. USS Johnston displaced 2,050 tons. The lead Japanese battleship, which he would later identify as Yamato, displaced 72,000 tons. Johnston carried 5 5-inch guns. Yamato mounted 9 18-1-inch rifles, each capable of hurling a shell weighing more than a Volkswagen over 25 miles. The mathematics of this engagement were not just unfavorable. They were suicidal. Behind Evans, the other destroyers of Taffy 3 were already making smoke, preparing to run. 6 escort carriers, designed to support amphibious landings, not fight surface engagements, were turning south at their maximum speed of 17 knots. The Japanese fleet was making 25. Simple arithmetic meant the carriers would be caught within 90 minutes. Standing orders for destroyer escorts in this situation were clear: lay smoke, make torpedo runs to disrupt enemy formations, then withdraw to preserve the fleet. Every destroyer commander in the U.S. Navy knew these orders. Every tactical manual emphasized preservation of assets over heroic gestures. Evans turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than imminent death. "Bob, sound general quarters. All ahead flank. Come left to course 270. We're going in." Hagen, 28 years old and fresh from the Naval Academy, stared at his commander as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "Sir, that course takes us directly at the Japanese fleet. The rest of Taffy 3 is withdrawing south." Evans allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "I'm aware of our heading, Mr. Hagen. The question is whether those carriers survive the next 2 hours. The answer depends on what we do in the next 2 minutes." As the general quarters alarm pierced the morning air and Johnston's crew raced to battle stations, Evans studied the Japanese formation through his binoculars one more time. The lead battleship was maintaining perfect formation, its massive guns trained forward, expecting the American destroyers to do exactly what doctrine dictated: run, hide behind smoke, perhaps launch torpedoes from maximum range before fleeing. The Japanese had fought the U.S. Navy for 3 years. They knew American destroyer tactics. They knew American doctrine. They knew what to expect. What they could not have known, could not have anticipated, was that Ernest Evans had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this moment. Not preparing to survive it. Preparing to make it matter. The son of a Cherokee father and a mother who cleaned houses to pay for his Naval Academy application, Evans had learned early that the world did not reward those who played by expected rules. At Annapolis, he had been told Native Americans did not belong in the officer corps. In his early career, he had been passed over for promotion twice because of his heritage. By 1944, he commanded a destroyer only because the Navy was desperate for experienced officers and could no longer afford the luxury of prejudice. Every step of his career had been a fight against impossible odds. This morning off Samar would be no different. Except this morning, the odds were not merely career-ending. They were fatal. Johnston surged forward, her engines straining to deliver 35 knots as Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Joseph Lawrence pushed the machinery beyond rated capacity. Below decks, fire room temperatures soared past 120 degrees as stokers fed oil to boilers designed for sustained operations at lower outputs. Lawrence knew what he was asking of his engines. He also knew that sustainability did not matter if they did not survive the next hour. On the bridge, Evans watched the range close with mathematical precision. 25,000 yards. 20,000. 18,000. At 15,000 yards, the Japanese fleet would be within effective range for Yamato's main battery. At that distance, an 18.1-inch shell could penetrate Johnston's hull like a rifle bullet through paper. The Japanese opened fire at 16,000 yards. The first salvo from Yamato's forward turrets was visible as a ripple of orange flame, followed seconds later by a sound like distant thunder. Evans counted. 1,001. 1,002. 1,003. The shells arrived with a sound beyond description, a screaming roar that seemed to tear the air itself. Four geysers of water erupted 300 yards short of Johnston's bow, each column rising higher than the destroyer's mast. Seaman First Class Michael Doherty, manning the aft 40mm gun mount, would later write to his mother, "The spray from those misses soaked us. We were scared, Ma. We all knew what those shells could do." But the old man just kept driving us straight at them like he was late for dinner. Evans made minute adjustments to Johnston's course, not to evade but to optimize his torpedo attack angle. His fire control officer, Lieutenant James Thompson, was already calculating firing solutions for Johnston's 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. The Mark 15 had a range of 6,000 yards at 46 knots. To guarantee hits against an evading target, Thompson needed to close to 4,000 yards. At Johnston's current approach speed, that meant enduring another 12 minutes under fire from the most powerful battleship ever constructed. The second salvo from Yamato arrived close enough that shrapnel from the shell bursts peppered Johnston's superstructure. A fragment the size of a fist punched through the forward smokestack, missing gunner's mate second-class Raymond Kowalski by inches. The third salvo straddled Johnston, 2 shells landing port, 2 shells landing starboard, the combined concussion lifting the destroyer partially out of the water. In the engine room, Lawrence and his crew were thrown against bulkheads as the ship bucked like a wild horse. Yet Johnston's engines never faltered. On the bridge, Evans watched the Japanese formation through the shell splashes with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The heavy cruisers were beginning to maneuver, attempting to bracket Johnston between crossing fire lanes. This was textbook Japanese doctrine, using superior firepower to create kill boxes that no destroyer could escape. But Evans was not trying to escape. At 14,000 yards, the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano opened fire with her 8-inch guns. At 13,000 yards, the cruiser Suzuya joined in. Johnston was now taking fire from 3 capital ships simultaneously, over 40 heavy guns trying to land a killing blow. Thompson called out from the fire control station. "Sir, optimal torpedo range in 90 seconds. Evans nodded. "Prepare to fire full spread on my mark. Target the lead battleship." But as Johnston closed to 5,000 yards, something happened that Evans had not anticipated. The Japanese fleet began to turn. Not a subtle course correction. A hard turn to starboard, the entire formation breaking its approach to the American carriers to maneuver away from a single destroyer. Through his binoculars, Evans could see the white water boiling up from Yamato's screws as the massive battleship heaved into an emergency turn, her 18-inch guns elevating to maximum angle in an attempt to hit Johnston at close range. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force from Yamato's bridge, would later write in his action report, "Contact report indicated minor American escort forces. Intelligence assessment suggested 6 escort carriers with destroyer screen. At 0658, 1 destroyer broke formation and charged our fleet at flank speed. Initial assessment, suicide attack. Revised assessment at 0706, torpedo attack. Ordered emergency maneuvers." the American commander displayed either complete tactical ignorance or a level of aggression we had not encountered in previous engagements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Kurita did not write, what he could not admit in an official report, was that for approximately 4 minutes that morning, the most powerful battleship in the Japanese Navy maneuvered defensively against a destroyer that weighed 1/35 as much. For 4 minutes, the initiative in the battle off Samar belonged not to the fleet with superior guns, armor, and speed, but to Ernest Evans and the 327 men of USS Johnston. Thompson called out. Firing solution locked. Range 4,200 yards. Evans raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. Fire all torpedoes. Johnston's torpedo tubes swung outboard with hydraulic precision, and 10 Mark 15 torpedoes leaped into the water in rapid succession, their compressed air impulse charges leaving trails of bubbles as they accelerated toward Yamato. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, spreading in a textbook fan pattern designed to guarantee at least 3 hits regardless of target maneuvers. On Yamato's bridge, Captain WWII Morishita watched the torpedo tracks with growing alarm. At 4,000 yards, the time to impact was approximately 3 minutes. Yamato could theoretically outrun torpedoes at flank speed, but not while in a turn. Not while the ship's momentum was carrying her broadside to the torpedo spread. Morishita had 3 choices: continue the turn and expose Yamato's vulnerable beam to multiple hits, reverse the turn and expose the stern, or maintain course and hope the torpedoes ran deep. He chose to maintain course, betting that American torpedoes would malfunction as they had so often early in the war. It was the wrong bet. At 0712 hours, 3 explosions rippled along Yamato's starboard side. The torpedoes detonated below the waterline, each warhead containing 825 pounds of Torpex explosive, each blast creating a pressure wave that buckled internal frames and ruptured bulkheads. Yamato's damage control officer reported flooding in 3 compartments, a 7-degree list to starboard, and speed reduced to 20 knots. Johnston had wounded a battleship with a displacement 35 times greater. But more importantly, Johnston had disrupted the Japanese formation at the critical moment when Kurita's fleet should have been running down the escort carriers. Instead of maintaining pursuit, the Japanese heavy cruisers were now maneuvering to support Yamato, while the destroyer's screen moved to counter what they assumed must be a coordinated American attack. The idea that a single destroyer, acting alone, would charge a battleship formation was so far outside Japanese tactical doctrine that Kurita's staff officers initially reported multiple American destroyers in the attack. Evans ordered hard right rudder, bringing Johnston around to a southerly course as Japanese shells continued to bracket his ship. A near miss from Kumano's 8-inch guns demolished Johnston's aft fire control director, killing 3 men instantly. Another shell from Suzuya penetrated the forward engine room, causing a steam explosion that scalded 4 engineers to death. Chief Lawrence, working in the aft engine room, reported forward propulsion lost, speed reduced to 25 knots. Johnston was hurt, bleeding from a dozen wounds, her forward engine room a tomb of superheated metal. But she was still moving, still fighting, and most critically, still drawing the attention of the Japanese fleet. Aboard the escort carrier Gamber Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watched Johnston's attack through a mixture of horror and awe. Sprague had commanded Taffy 3 for 6 months. He knew every captain, every ship, every capability and limitation of his tiny force. When the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon, he had written off his carriers as lost, hoping only to buy time for the troops ashore on Leyte. But Johnston's attack had done something Sprague thought impossible. It had made the Japanese hesitate. Sprague's air officer reported. "Admiral, the Japs have reduced speed. Their formation is scattered. Estimate we've gained 15, maybe 20 minutes. Sprague did the math instantly. 20 minutes meant his carriers could launch every aircraft, could get fighters and torpedo bombers into the air even if the carriers themselves were sunk. 20 minutes meant the invasion forces on Leyte beaches might survive. 20 minutes of borrowed time, purchased with the lives of 327 sailors on a destroyer that should have been running away. Evans stood on Johnston's bridge, his left hand gripping the rail, his right hand holding a blood-soaked handkerchief to a shrapnel wound on his head. 2 fingers on his left hand were missing, severed by a shell fragment he had not even noticed hit him. Around him, the bridge was a shambles. The windows were blown out, the radar mast was collapsed, and a 6-inch hole in the deck revealed the torn metal of the compartment below. But the steering still answered, the guns still fired, and Johnston still sailed toward the enemy. Hagen approached carefully, his uniform torn and blackened by smoke. "Sir, we've lost the forward engine room. Casualty reports are still coming in, but estimate 23 dead, 37 wounded. We have 3 operational gun mounts and approximately 40% ammunition remaining." Evans nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the Japanese fleet. "Mr. Hagen, what is the status of the other destroyers?" Hagen consulted the tactical plot, though most of the information was now coming from visual observation rather than radar. "Heermann and Hull have both made torpedo runs. Samuel B. Roberts is engaging the cruisers. The carriers are launching aircraft." Evans allowed himself a tight smile. "Then we've bought them time. The question now is how much more we can buy." Hagen understood what his commander was not saying. They had launched their torpedoes. They had lost half their speed. By every tactical standard, Johnston had completed her mission and should withdraw. But Evans was not interested in tactical standards. He was interested in how many more minutes he could keep Japanese guns pointed at Johnston instead of at the carriers. The answer to that question came at 0727 hours when heavy cruiser Kumano, having finally gotten Johnston's range, landed a direct hit on the destroyer's bridge. The 8-inch shell penetrated the thin armor and detonated inside the bridge space. The explosion killed 7 men outright and turned the bridge into a slaughterhouse. Evans, standing near the chart table, was thrown against the bulkhead with such force that he felt ribs crack. Hagen, at the helm, took shrapnel in both legs and collapsed. The helmsman, Quartermaster 3rd Class William Foster, was decapitated by a piece of the ship's own radar mast, driven through his neck like a spear. For perhaps 10 seconds, no one moved on Johnston's bridge. Smoke and the acrid smell of explosive filled the space. Then Evans, his uniform soaked in blood that was not entirely his own, pulled himself upright using the bent remains of the compass binnacle. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Damage report." From the aft steering station, Chief Bosun's mate Harold Jenkins called up through the voice tube. "Bridge is hit bad, sir. We can steer from aft." "What are your orders?" Evans looked at the Japanese fleet through the shattered bridge windows. Kumano was closing, clearly intending to finish Johnston with her remaining guns. 2 Japanese destroyers were also moving in, smelling blood. The escort carriers were now hull down on the southern horizon, their aircraft beginning to swarm over the Japanese fleet like angry hornets. Johnston had bought them perhaps 25 minutes. It would have to be enough. Maintain course. All remaining gun mounts, engage targets of opportunity. We're not done yet. What happened over the next 43 minutes would become the subject of naval study for the next 80 years. A destroyer with 1 engine, half her guns destroyed, her bridge a wreck, and her commander bleeding from a dozen wounds, continued to engage the Japanese center force. Not from a distance. Not with hit-and-run tactics. But in a close-range gunfight that violated every principle of naval warfare. Johnston's remaining 5-inch guns, now directed by local control since the fire control director was gone, engaged Japanese destroyers at ranges as close as 7,000 yards. Gunner's Mate First Class Anthony Matsuoki, commanding the No. 2 gun mount, would later testify that he fired 127 rounds that morning, scoring hits on 2 destroyers and 1 heavy cruiser. "We couldn't miss at that range. The question wasn't whether we'd hit them. The question was whether we'd survive long enough to fire the next round." At 0741, Johnston's aft engine room took a direct hit from a 14-inch shell fired by battleship Congo. the explosion tore open the hole below the waterline and killed Chief Lawrence and 13 of his engineering crew instantly. Johnston's speed dropped to 12 knots, then to 8, then to bare steerageway. She was dying, settling slowly by the stern as seawater poured through wounds too numerous to count. Yet her guns continued to fire, each shot now aimed with deliberate precision because every round had to count. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Kurita received reports that confused and disturbed him. The American destroyer that had attacked his flagship was still fighting. Still firing. Still refusing to sink despite hits from multiple ships. His gunnery officer reported that Johnston had absorbed damage equivalent to a light cruiser and was still operational. The destroyer's survival was interfering with the fleet's advance, drawing fire that should have been directed at the carriers, creating confusion in the tactical picture. Kurita made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 0809 hours, he ordered the fleet to withdraw. The official reason given was concern about American air attacks and the possibility of running into the main American fleet. But the unstated reason, the reason that would emerge only years later in interviews with Japanese officers, was simpler. Kurita had lost confidence that he could achieve his objective without unacceptable losses. And a significant factor in that calculation was the psychological impact of watching a single American destroyer refuse to die. Commander Hironaka Sato, gunnery officer aboard Yamato, wrote in his personal diary, "We fired over 300 shells at the American destroyer. We hit her perhaps 40 times. She should have sunk in the first 10 minutes. Instead, she fought for over an hour. If one destroyer could do this, what would the main American fleet do?" The admiral made the right choice to withdraw. We were not fighting men. We were fighting something we did not understand. What Sato and the Japanese fleet did not understand was not a matter of equipment or tactics. It was a fundamental difference in how the two navies approached impossible situations. The Japanese Navy, for all its skill and courage, fought according to doctrine that emphasized preservation of force and carefully calculated risks. The American Navy, particularly its destroyer forces, had evolved a different philosophy. When faced with impossible odds, American destroyers attacked. This was not doctrine. No manual taught it. No admiral ordered it. It was something deeper, something that had evolved through 3 years of desperate fighting across the Pacific. From the Solomons to the Philippines, American destroyers had learned that when the situation was hopeless, the only response was to charge directly into the teeth of the enemy and make them pay for every yard of ocean. Johnston's attack was the apotheosis of this philosophy. One destroyer, alone, charging a battleship that outweighed her 35 to 1, that outgunned her by ratios that made mathematical comparison meaningless. And in doing so, buying 25 minutes for the carriers, disrupting the Japanese fleet's cohesion, and ultimately contributing to Kurita's decision to withdraw. At 0810 hours, Johnston was dead in the water, her engines silent, her guns empty, her decks awash as the sea claimed her. Evans, barely conscious from blood loss and a probable concussion, ordered abandon ship. The crew, those who could still move, began going over the side into the warm tropical water. They carried the wounded with them, improvised stretchers made from deck planks and life jackets. As Evans prepared to leave the ship, he took one last look at the Japanese fleet. Kurita's battleships were already turning north, their pagoda masts disappearing into the haze. The escort carriers were safe, their aircraft harassing the retreating Japanese force. Evans had achieved his objective. It had cost him his ship, half his crew, and very likely his own life. But the carriers were safe. At 0820 hours, USS Johnston rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves. Of her complement of 327 officers and men, 186 survived to be rescued over the next 3 days. Evans was not among them. His body was never recovered. The last confirmed sighting was of him standing on Johnston's stern, refusing a life jacket, watching his men abandon ship before the destroyer's final plunge. What happened that morning off Samar Island should have been a footnote in naval history. A destroyer attacked a battleship and was sunk. The mathematics were entirely predictable. What made it significant, What elevated it beyond a simple combat loss was the ripple effect of Johnston's attack. By disrupting the Japanese fleet at the critical moment, by forcing Kurita to maneuver defensively, by demonstrating a level of aggression that the Japanese had not anticipated, Evans and his crew bought enough time for Taffy 3 to survive. Of the 6 escort carriers Evans died protecting, 5 made it home. Hundreds of aircraft launched from those carriers would go on to support the invasion of Leyte, the liberation of the Philippines, and ultimately the defeat of Japan. The battle off Samar saw the Japanese center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had committed to a single engagement, turned back by a force that should not have lasted 30 minutes. Kurita's fleet included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against this, Taffy 3 fielded 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers. The mathematical odds were comparable to Johnston's individual engagement with Yamato, insurmountable. Yet the Japanese withdrew, and the Americans survived. Naval analysts would spend decades studying what happened that morning. The conclusion, uncomfortable for professional naval officers, was that mathematics and firepower were not the only factors in naval combat. Psychology mattered. Aggression mattered. The willingness to charge into certain death, if it served a larger purpose, mattered more than tonnage or gun calibers. Evans understood this instinctively. When he ordered Johnston to charge the Japanese fleet, he was not calculating odds of survival. He was calculating maximum impact. How much damage could one destroyer do? How much time could one destroyer buy? How much chaos could one destroyer create? The answer was, enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change the outcome. Enough to save thousands of American lives on the beaches of Leyte who would have died if the Japanese fleet had broken through to the landing zones. After the war, survivors of Johnston gathered annually to remember their ship and their commander. At the 1955 reunion, Hagen, who had recovered from his wounds and retired as a captain, raised a toast. To the old man. Who taught us that size doesn't matter. That firepower doesn't matter. That the only thing that matters is whether you're willing to sail into hell to buy 5 more minutes for someone else. Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation read, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation was true but inadequate. What Evans did that morning off Samar was not about gallantry or heroism in the traditional sense. It was about cold calculation of what one ship, properly employed at the critical moment, could achieve. The Japanese Navy learned different lessons from the battle off Samar. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers revealed a consistent theme: shock at American tactical aggression. The idea that destroyers would charge battleships, that escort carriers would launch attack runs against heavy cruisers, that the weaker force would attack rather than run, violated Japanese understanding of naval combat. Captain Morishita of Yamato wrote in 1953, "We trained to fight the American Navy as we understood it from peacetime observations. Methodical. Cautious. Superior in numbers and equipment but not in spirit. The Americans we fought off Samar were not the Americans we had prepared to fight. They fought with a desperation and aggression that made numerical superiority irrelevant." This assessment missed the crucial point. American destroyers off Samar were not desperate. They were calculated. Evans did not charge Yamato in a panic. He charged because he had done the mathematics and determined that one destroyer, trading itself for 25 minutes, was an acceptable exchange rate. This was not suicide. It was cold-blooded tactical economics. The Japanese could not comprehend this because their naval culture emphasized preservation of force. A ship was valuable. Throwing it away was wasteful. But American industrial capacity had created a different calculus. America was building destroyers faster than Japan could sink them. By October 1944, American shipyards were completing a destroyer every 5 days. In the time it took to repair Yamato from Johnston's torpedo hits, America would build 6 new destroyers. Evans probably did not know these statistics. But he understood the fundamental truth: American ships were replaceable. Time was not. If Johnston could buy 25 minutes by trading itself, that was an excellent exchange rate. The escort carriers those minutes saved would launch aircraft that would sink Japanese ships that could not be replaced. The mathematical chain was elegant in its brutality. This industrial reality was not visible from Johnston's bridge that morning. What was visible were Japanese battleships and the need to stop them. What Evans could not see, what he died not knowing, was that his ship was part of a larger system that was grinding Japan down through sheer productive capacity. Every destroyer America lost, every plane shot down, every tank destroyed, was replaced within weeks. Japan's losses were permanent. The Yamato herself became a symbol of this mismatch. The largest battleship ever constructed, she represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. She displaced 72,000 tons, cost as much as 1,000 tanks, and required resources equivalent to building 50 destroyers. In April 1945, she was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa, carrying only enough fuel for the outbound trip. American aircraft sank her before she even reached the combat zone. A battleship that survived Johnston's torpedoes, that represented years of Japanese industrial effort, was destroyed by aircraft launched from the very carriers Evans died protecting. The mathematics of industrial warfare were inescapable. Japan's entire naval construction program from 1941 to 1945 produced 12 destroyers. In that same period, America built 349. Japan built 6 fleet carriers. America built 141. Every category showed the same disparity. Steel production, oil refining, aircraft manufacturing, all favored America by ratios that made military victory mathematically impossible. But these statistics were abstractions in October 1944. What was real was the Japanese fleet bearing down on Taffy 3 and Ernest Evans calculating how to stop them with a 2,050-ton destroyer. The industrial numbers told a story Evans never lived to understand. While Johnston fought her final battle, American shipyards were completing their 73rd Fletcher-class destroyer of 1944. Japanese yards had managed 4 destroyers that entire year. The disparity extended beyond hulls. American destroyers carried radar fire control that allowed accurate gunnery at night and in poor visibility. Japanese ships relied on optical rangefinders perfected in the 1920s. American damage control doctrine emphasized compartmentalization and redundancy. Japanese ships, optimized for offensive power, sacrificed survivability for bigger guns. These advantages were invisible to Johnston's crew as they abandoned ship. What they experienced was simpler: their destroyer had attacked a battleship and forced it to maneuver defensively. In that moment, technology and production statistics mattered less than the willingness to close range and fight. But across the broader Pacific War, those statistics were grinding Japan into defeat. American submarine production meant Japan lost merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. American aircraft production meant air superiority over every battlefield. American shipbuilding meant naval losses were temporary setbacks rather than strategic disasters. Admiral Kurita's withdrawal from Samar sealed Japan's fate in the Philippines. The troop transports Evans died protecting landed their cargo unmolested. Those troops would recapture Manila, cut Japanese supply lines, and strand 350,000 Japanese soldiers without support. The strategic cascade that began with Johnston charging Yamato ended with Japan losing its last defensive position before the home islands. Japanese officers studying the battle found the American tactics incomprehensible. Commander Otani Yoshio wrote that sacrificing destroyers to save carriers violated efficient resource allocation. American carriers could build replacement destroyers. Destroyers could not build replacement carriers. Therefore, carriers should be sacrificed to preserve destroyers. This logic was mathematically sound and strategically wrong. It missed that American industrial capacity made the calculation irrelevant. Carriers and destroyers were both replaceable. What mattered was maintaining combat power at the decisive point. Evans understood this instinctively. His destroyer was expendable if spending it bought time for the carriers to launch aircraft. Those aircraft would sink Japanese ships that could never be replaced. the exchange rate was brutally favorable. Post-war analysis revealed Johnston absorbed approximately 40 hits from guns ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber. She should have sunk after the first heavy shell penetrated her hull. That she remained combat effective for over an hour testified to American damage control training and hull design. Japanese destroyers hit by similar punishment typically sank within minutes. This survivability gap, like the production gap, reflected systematic American advantages that accumulated into overwhelming superiority. The lesson extended beyond World War II. In modern naval combat, the side willing to accept calculated losses to achieve objectives holds the initiative. The side focused on preserving assets concedes initiative to the enemy. Evans demonstrated this principle in its purest form. One ship, properly employed at the critical moment, could alter the outcome of an entire campaign. The mathematics of tonnage and firepower suggested Johnston's attack was futile. The reality of combat proved otherwise. Survivors gathered at reunions for decades after the war. They never used words like sacrifice or heroism. Instead, they spoke of doing the job. The job was protecting the carriers. The method was charging the Japanese fleet. The cost was acceptable because the mission succeeded. This utilitarian view of naval combat would have horrified peacetime theorists but reflected how destroyers actually fought across the Pacific. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.